If you've ever had this feeling that something was terribly wrong with the world that we live in, but you couldn't figure out just what it was, then you've come to the right place. Secret societies, mystery religions, and the Illuminati have been controlling our reality since the beginning of time. But not anymore, because there is an awakening happening, and you are about to become a part of it. Wake up, because this is a call for an uprising.
This is a call for an uprising. Welcome to today's show. This is an important episode. I want to make sure everybody watches it and learns about these things. Much like the video I did covering McMartin, which a lot of you already were aware of, but I wanted to put something together for people out there who had never heard of it, who only had heard of Pizzagate, because people need to become aware that SRA, satanic ritual abuse, has been going on for a long time, and it's been getting covered up for a long time. And while I was doing the video on McMartin, I was looking into some other cases from the 90s, one of which was the Oak Hill satanic ritual abuse trial, which not many people had heard about. Now, while I was researching this trial and preparing to do a video on it, and this is how God always works, right? I happened to check out what was going on over at the Satanic Temple, and they happened to make multiple posts in the past week in regards to this trial, because the two people who were on trial were exonerated. As always, the common theme, these Satanists get off the hook when these trials happen involving satanic ritual abuse, because all they have to do is label it satanic panic. And I'll tell you about the trial, and I'll tell you about the things that children came forward and exposed these people as doing. But what a surprise, right? That the Satanic Temple was commenting and saying how great it was that these people were free. They were wrongly convicted. And again, common theme here, the Satanists always are the victims, right? In McMartin, they made them look like the victims, not the children who were raped and molested. In the West Memphis 3 case, right? Nobody talks about the 3 children who were raped and brutally murdered. They talk about, oh, the poor Satanist witches who were on trial, who got convicted because they were wearing Metallica shirts and looked different than everybody else. That was the common theme, right? Nobody talking about these poor kids who were killed. The same thing with this trial and many others. They turned the Satanists into victims. This is part of how the mind control works. Now, we all know that the media created the term satanic panic, just like they created the term, and the CIA created the term conspiracy theory, and now we have fake news. These are terms that are trigger words to get people to roll their eyes and instantly dismiss any of these cases because they sound so insane to the common person who isn't aware of the occult and how they operate and what they do. But the McMartin case, what it did was it opened up a can of worms for them, because as the media continued picking up on it, more children started to come forward. More children felt brave enough to come forward and talk about this because they were hearing about it on the news. Their parents were talking to them about it, making it okay for them to come out and talk about it and making them feel comfortable talking about it. Because remember, trauma-based mind control, when they victimize these young kids, there's a reason that they don't go telling their parents. People go, if it was real, why didn't they immediately go home and tell their parents? Because they're under trauma-based mind control. When you take a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old child and you smash the skull of a cat or a dog in front of that child and you tell them that that's what they're going to do to them and their family if they tell anybody, that causes alters, that causes trauma and disassociation in their brains. They're in fear of ever telling anyone. What happened with McMartin is when these kids came forward, the first child, it led to other children coming forward because they weren't afraid anymore. Their parents were telling them, listen, it's okay. We won't get hurt. Tell us what happened to you. And all these children started telling them what happened to them because they didn't feel afraid anymore. That is why trauma is so important in these satanic ritual abuse cases, because they use the trauma of mutilating animals and other things that they do to these kids to control them, to control their minds. And these kids live in fear of ever telling anyone. Now, before I get into the case, I want to say one other thing. A common theme, again, in the 90s with satanic ritual abuse was these daycare centers were used as fronts. Daycare centers were used as fronts. They had witches, members of covens, and Satanists run these daycare centers and prostitute the children out of these centers. They would ritually abuse them themselves, and then they would give these kids during the day when the kids were dropped off to other people out there, politicians, people of wealth and power, and they would perform pedophilia and satanic rituals on these children as well. So remember that daycare centers were a front. I'm not saying today that every daycare center is a front for this stuff, but at that time, that was how they were getting away with it because they had already created the woman and the man in the workplace. Okay, so the parents were dependent on dropping their children off somewhere because they had nobody to look after the kids. They created all these fronts of daycare centers, and that's where they were using and exploiting and abusing these children. Now today, what we see is a lot of small businesses set up as fronts for Satanists. We see small businesses like we saw at Pizzagate, right? Something that would be out of comprehension for most people to think that a pizza parlor or a restaurant could be a front for pedophilia. But there's a lot of places. There's dry cleaners, there's donut shops, there's a lot of places that they use as fronts, not so much daycare centers anymore because this opened up a huge can of worms where all of these kids were coming forward and admitting to being, involved in these ceremonies where people were going, oh, the kids are just making up. Yeah, thousands of kids came forward, and they all just had the same story about people dressed as druids, watching animals get mutilated, drinking blood. It's ridiculous how they continue to play it off and say that these kids are crazy and that the victims were these adults running the daycare centers. Okay? But again, they do still use daycare centers. Okay, not probably big ones that you hear about like KinderCare and stuff like that, but they still do. Because this stuff still goes on. It's just brushed underneath, it's swept underneath the mat. Because now they have full control of the media. No leaks ever come out. And they know that they can just call us crazy Christians for talking about this stuff. So let me talk to you about the Oak Hill Satanic ritual abuse trial, which occurred in Austin, Texas in 1991. Fran Keller and her husband, Dan, ran a daycare center. They were accused of repeatedly and sadistically abusing several children. The Kellers were convicted of multiple charges and sentenced to 48 years in prison, but were freed in 2013 based on newly revealed information about misconduct by the prosecution and other authorities. The charges against them were just dismissed this past week, which is coincidence because I just started looking into this 2 weeks ago. So these charges were just dismissed, which is a complete joke, and I'll get into more of that towards the end of the video. Now, what happened was in the summer of 1991, a therapist of a 3-year-old child being treated for behavioral problems due to her parents' divorce alleged that the Kellers had sexually abused her. The child's mother contacted the police, who alerted the case's eventual prosecuting attorney, who contacted a friend whose child was also enrolled in the same daycare center and being treated by the same therapist. During the time leading up to the trial, 2 other children from the daycare offered similar accusations. According to the children, the couple served blood-laced Kool-Aid and forced them to have videotaped sex with adults and other children. The Kellers, they said, sometimes wore white robes and lit candles before hurting them. See these common themes here? Not just the pedophilia, the dressing up in the robes, the lighting of the candles, doing it inside of the pentagram, the ritual circle with the pentagram in the middle. All these kids, 2, 3 years old, 4 years old, they're all just making it up, right? Oh, they're all just getting together going, hey, it'd be great. Let's make this story up about these people dressed up in robes. They wouldn't even know what a druid robe was or a ritual was. It's absolutely ridiculous how they get away with this stuff. The children also accused the Kellers of forcing them to watch or participate in the killing and dismemberment of cats, dogs, and a crying baby. Okay, this is a common theme with what? With McMartin, with Hampstead, with the Franklin cover-up, with all of these things, talking about how they would kill animals in front of them. And they forced these people to be involved, these children to be involved in rituals involving the murder and sacrifice of babies. But yet they keep saying that all of these kids just keep making up this story. What 4-year-old, has this story in the back of his mind that matches up with someone else's story? What did the 4-year-old get on the phone with a 2-year-old in California in 1990 from the McMartin trial and say, hey, what do you got? What are you making up over there? Oh, I'm going to make this up too. We're going to talk about, robes and cloaks and killing animals. Of course not. But that's what they want you to think. Because remember, they make themselves the victims. Remember I talked about in some of my videos how the Rockefellers, how these, the Bushes and all these people and all these celebrities, they make themselves philanthropists, right? They create something in the mind by making them look like someone they're not. So what I'm saying is that by being philanthropists, they will tell people out there, oh, they're great people, they're caring for kids. They would never molest a kid because they run these charitable donations or charitable organizations that are geared towards helping children who are less privileged. Well, it's the same with stuff like this. They turn the person who is involved in, listen to these accusations that multiple children make, killing babies, killing dogs and cats, and somehow they make these people the victim because they have everybody so clueless about occults about Satanism, witchcraft, and all this stuff, that they make it seem like, oh my goodness, what a crazy lunatic-like story. These poor people who went to jail for all these years, these poor people, they never talk about the children being victims. So in addition to making them participate in the killing of animals and crying babies, bodies were unearthed in cemeteries, and they forced the kids to dig up holes to bury the animals and the babies. And the kids also, which is a common theme with McMartin, right? Common theme with Franklin Cover-Up. The children were called several plane trips where they would be flown into Mexico and be sexually abused by soldiers before returning to Austin in time to meet their parents at the daycare. Common theme with McMartin. The children claim that they were flown up in the mountains in an airplane, right? And I showed that in the video where Ted Gunderson went up there. They found a house that conveniently burnt to the ground the day after this stuff leaked. The house just happened to burn down. Inside the house, nothing but satanic symbols written all over the walls, the 666, the pentagram, altars. Must have been a coincidence, right? Flying these children out and doing this stuff to them. Now, what happened with this case was an organization called Believe the Children, which was created by the parents involved in the McMartin preschool trial. Children were enrolled in the Kellers daycare were repeatedly questioned by parents, therapists, and law enforcement officers as part of the investigation. Now, if you remember in the McMartin video, I talked about how eventually, and what they talk about now with McMartin is they say, wow, it was groundbreaking because we realized that we can't have these organizations that are independent like Believe the Children because these therapists grill the children over and over and they think that they persuade them into making up these stories about satanic ritual abuse. And that was just a way for them to get control, to make sure all these organizations are government-funded organizations that do the interviewing with children, because what they do is they make sure that the children don't confess to satanic ritual abuse. And they'll tell the parent, well, the kid is suffering really from bipolar or schizophrenia or something like that, and they'll get the case dismissed. That's what they did. So they hijacked any independent study, any independent research, any independent investigators or therapists from talking to these children. And that's how they got this case eventually dismissed now. The Kellers went to a 6-day trial. Some of the kids ended up flip-flopping on some of their stories like we saw with Hampstead. And this is through pure influence. They're influenced. They're threatened. Okay, children are vulnerable. And when somebody they see, who has killed babies and killed animals and killed humans in front of them comes and threatens them, they might actually flip-flop their story because they might not want to die or they might not want their parents or loved ones to die. But these people were found guilty and given sentences of 48 years each. Now, later, of course, now remember, so many people are wrongfully imprisoned, right? But constantly we hear about the West Memphis 3. Now we hear, this story and others. They constantly go out of their way to get these Satanists out of prisons, to get them out. They're free and make them the victims. So a later investigation of the case revealed serious problems. There's no physical evidence of abuse, they claim, despite all of these children claiming to be abused, claiming to see the same things. They said there was flawed medical exams of the children. Testimony by a dubious expert on satanic ritual abuse ended up being flawed, they claimed. And eventually they let these two out of prison. Now, on June 20th, like I said last week, the Travis County District Attorney's Office announced that the case against the Kellers had been dismissed. Fully dismissed, fully dropped. No big deal, right? Children who were victimized. Again, just conveniently making up the story, right? That's what they just constantly say. These kids make up these stories. They make up these stories. And here's the cherry on top. This declaration, which has dropped the case now, also permits these two to apply for $80,000 a year in restitution from a state fund earmarked for victims of wrongful convictions. So they're going to get backtracked $80K a year per person, going back to 1991, which means over $1 million at least, maybe $2 million, depending on what taxes come out of it. So not only are they freed after all of these stories came out that people just made, you can look at them and you could just tell that these are witches and Satanists. Creepiest people, it's something out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre if you watch the guy talk. With his crooked teeth, his creepy smile. Of course, he lets the woman do most of the talking. Because remember, women play a huge role in this. They're the ones who really end up being the caregivers and the takers of the children. They're the ones who, persuade. Like we see this with McMartin. We see it with a lot of places. The women, you look at them and you say, oh, it's just some old, nice granny or some, it's some 40, 50-year-old woman. She wouldn't do any of this stuff. They play on the front of being these nice, caring, loving women, but they're really witches. And remember that because it's not just men who are involved in this. It's both. And a lot of the times with these satanic ritual abuse, trials, and when evidence comes forward, it's women who are normally the caregivers who hand these children over to these men who are involved in these satanic rituals, but there's women involved as well. So not only do they get $80,000 a year per person, that's $160,000 a year. Backtrack to 1991, they walk free, and the story comes out that they were victims of satanic panic. Nobody talks about the children and what happened to them. And any story that comes out about the children, of course, is, oh, the children made it up, and now they even admit it because they probably were paid off or scared to death to talk about it. And where do we see this posted, right? Right on the Satanic Temple's website. I thought that they weren't Satanists. I thought they didn't care about this kind of stuff. Oh, wait, anything involving SRA, it's their job to talk about it and say satanic panic isn't real. Satanism's not real, okay? We don't ritually abuse kids. The only two things they focus on are what? They go after anyone who claims to be a victim of satanic ritual abuse, and they make sure to be outside every abortion clinic because they need those babies sacrificed. It's a complete joke, and it's a ruse. And it's funny that they have this posted all over their Twitter because they're nothing but liars and hypocrites, just like these people who are now walking free. But they look like they're old farts, these two. And there's no beating Father Time. So sooner or later, their judgment will come, and more likely for them, it'll be sooner. Just another story, folks. Another one of these quote-unquote satanic panic trials that occurred in the 90s. And you don't hear about many of them now. You know why? Because like I said, all the organizations involved with interviewing the children, talking to the children, they're all government connected now. They're all trained. There's all Satanists involved and witches involved in the interviewing process. They're all planted there. So when kids do come in and talk about this stuff, they'll tell the parents that the child is having some type of traumatic episode. Oh, and it's relating to something happening at his house, and now he needs medication. These crazy visions that he's having of adults dressed up in the woods as druids, killing cats and animals and babies. It's all made up. Even though all these kids who came forward and still try to come forward talk about the same exact stuff. But again, they must have in the 90s all got their cell phones out in 1990 at 2 years old and 4 years old, or the parents got together and said, let's do this for fun and let's go after these Satanists or these daycare centers and let's call them Satanists. That's their excuse. That's how they get away with it. They make it look ridiculous when it's not, and they don't care about the children, and they make these Satanists the victims, always making themselves the victims. It's an absolute farce. It's a complete joke. It makes me sick. I'll talk more about some of these other trials that have occurred. I want to make people aware of these things because I know that a lot of people aren't. You can look into it in more detail if you'd like. There's some stuff out there, interviews with these people. I didn't want to put any of the videos in here for the sake of a copyright strike, since I already have a community guideline strike and one more strike, and I won't be able to upload. So you could check those things out for yourself. But again, it's just another incident in this country where Satanists walk free while children are victimized, and everybody scratches their head and thinks it's satanic panic, when in reality, it's real. These children are victimized by these scumbags, and they get away with it. It's absolutely an abomination. I thank you for listening to today's show. God bless all of you and your families.